Welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here because today we're unpacking something that is literally transformed right beneath our feet, and that is global trade. We used to think of international trade purely in terms of spreadsheets and economics, right? Buying cheap, selling high, just moving boxes from point A to point B. Well, that era is completely over. Today, global trade is modern statecraft. It's the absolute foundation of changing geopolitics. So if we really want to understand how the world is being reshaped today, we have to follow the trade agreements. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to hit trade as geopolitical chess, India's strategic policy shift, the India-US Trade Pact, the India-EU Economic Alliance, and we'll wrap up with sectoral winners and losers. Let's jump in.
All right, Section 1, Trade as Geopolitical Chess.
Like I mentioned, spreadsheets, tariffs, and simple supply and demand, they just aren't the whole story anymore. It's much more like a giant chessboard now. We moved away from a purely economic focus, where everyone just cared about market efficiency, to a deeply, deeply strategic focus. Nations today are actively negotiating these agreements to guarantee supply chain resilience, lock down their tech, secure materials for green energy, and really cement their geopolitical alignments. Economic partnerships are now completely intertwined with national security.
So you might be wondering, what actually forced this seismic shift? Well, it really comes down to four massive global drivers. First, you've got the US-China rivalry, which led to a lot of de-risking and tech decoupling. Second is the rise of the Global South. With expansions like BRICS, more nations are standing up and demanding greater influence. Third, the Russia-Ukraine war, that completely scrambled and realigned global energy and food security. And finally, the green transition, has everyone scrambling to secure critical minerals. Together, these four events shattered the old landscape. They forced nations to use trade as their main tool for global influence.
Moving right along to Section 2, India's strategic policy shift.
That global fragmentation brings us to one of the most fascinating case studies on the board right now. For the longest time, India's approach to trade was pretty conservative. They leaned heavily on multilateral organizations like the WTO. But with the WTO kind of declining and sweeping global negotiations stalling out, India made a hard pivot. Lately, they've adopted what's being called a fast clip strategy for free trade agreements. Because we live in a multipolar world now, India is aggressively pursuing swift, one-on-one bilateral and regional pacts. It's their way of asserting themselves as a true economic powerhouse.
And there are three specific pillars driving this new proactive approach. First up is the Indo-Pacific strategy. This is absolutely crucial when you remember that over 60% of global maritime trade passes through Asia. Securing those routes is a top priority. Second, it's a direct counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative. India is doing this by expanding supply chain ties with Western economies. And third, really prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic, India wants to position itself as the go-to resilient manufacturing alternative to China, drawing in foreign investment like never before.
Let's look at exactly where India stands today, right before these new deals fully kick in. Notice the trade deficits they have with the UAE, Australia, and the FTA nations. That's mainly driven by importing essentials, things like oil, coal, and gold. But look at the top of the board. India has a massive trade surplus with the United States, a positive $45 billion, and a $15 billion surplus with the EU. This data perfectly sets the stage for why the US and the EU are India's absolute most critical negotiations right now.
Which brings us to Section 3, the India-US Trade Pact.
$500 billion. Let that sink in. That is the sheer, staggering scale of this agreement. The US and India are seeing a huge convergence of their economic and strategic interests, and they've set a massively ambitious goal together: hit $500 billion in bilateral trade over the next decade.
But of course, these negotiations don't happen in a vacuum. They're heavily influenced by domestic laws. And it's important we impartially look at a major legal development that shifted the leverage here. In the case of Learning Resources Inc. versus Trump, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that unilateral presidential tariffs were not authorized under the IEPA framework. Basically, the ruling clarified that under the U.S. Constitution, tariffs are taxes, so they fall under Congress's authority, not the president's. The direct result? It invalidated reciprocal tariffs on several countries, including India, essentially resetting duties back to standard rates. Strategically, because the legal basis for those unilateral tariffs vanished, the U.S. lost some immediate negotiating leverage. And that means India might now hold firm against offering concessions in tricky areas like agriculture or digital trade. As a result of these evolving dynamics, we're seeing some really drastic tariff reductions. We're talking about U.S. tariffs on Indian goods dropping from up to 50% all the way down to about 18%. That is a 32 percentage point drop. It's a real game changer that dramatically restores the competitiveness of Indian exports.
Now, this is the true give and take of modern statecraft. Both sides need a win, right? Actually, there's a good chance the last generic prescription you filled has ties to this very agreement. India supplies a massive chunk of generic medicines to the US. Under this pact, Indian generic pharmacies reduced or even zero duty, giving their exports an incredible boost. In exchange, the US gets to expand its LNG and energy exports straight into India and sees lower tariffs on US aircraft parts. It's a brilliant strategic matching of India's healthcare strengths with America's energy might.
Next up, Section 4, the India-EU Economic Alliance.
Pivoting across the globe, India is negotiating a very different but totally vital pact with the European Union. The goal here isn't just some quick win. They're looking for deep, long-term integration. The expected impact of this FTA is huge, a 40% to 60% increase in bilateral trade over the next 10 years. We're going to see a major spike in EU investment flowing into India and a much, much stronger manufacturing linkage between the two.
So what's the actual trade-off looking like here? Well, the EU really wants access to India's highly protected auto market, where tariffs are sitting anywhere between 60 to 100%. The plan is to gradually drop that down to 10 to 15% over the next decade. That's a massive win for German, French, and Italian car makers. On the flip side, India gets incredible access for its textiles and apparel. EU tariffs on Indian textiles are currently around 8 to 12%, but this new pact pushes for 0% duty across a ton of categories. That opens the door for unprecedented growth in India's apparel sector.
Finally, Section 5, Sectoral Winners and Losers. Zooming all the way in to the ground level, what do these sweeping geopolitical moves mean for everyday industries? When you summarize the clear victories, especially in the US pact, a distinct pattern pops up. India is winning big in labor-intensive and specialized manufacturing. Think textiles, garments, gems, engineering goods, and pharmaceuticals. They're also doing well with specific ag exports like spices and tea. The USA's victories, on the other hand, lean heavily into high-value resources, major ag exports like nuts and feed grains, heavy machinery, energy like LNG, and alcoholic beverages.
And this is absolutely crucial to remember. Even in modern, fast-moving FTAs, domestic politics still set hard boundaries. There are heavily protected, entirely untouched sectors on both sides, mostly to defend domestic workforces. For India, sectors like dairy, wheat, rice, poultry, and sugar are completely walled off. Because at the end of the day, free trade definitely has its limits when local livelihoods and national food security are on the line.
Which really leaves us with this final thought. We started out today looking at a global chessboard, and we ended by looking at the price of a generic prescription, or the source of the parts in your car. In a multipolar world driven by strategic alliances, how will these deeply intertwined economic agreements reshape the global industries you rely on every single day? Because the deals they're signing right now, they aren't just about tariffs. They are literally laying the tracks for the next century of global power. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will catch you next time.